It all began in the early days of our marriage, when Angela and I were still figuring out how to live together under one roof. We were two young people trying to balance love with the everyday struggles of life. Back then, we celebrated little milestones, like buying our first house, raising two energetic boys, and settling into a cozy suburban life. But as time went on, the perfect image of our life started to crack. Angela had always been the adventurous one, eager to explore new things, while I leaned toward the comfort of a predictable routine. These differences grew over the years, creating a growing gap between us. I threw myself into work and raising our kids, while Angela seemed to crave something outside the life we had built together. One quiet Sunday, I found myself wandering around a hardware store. I probably should have been at church, but walking through aisles of tools seemed more appealing. I didn't really need anything, but it felt better than wasting the day playing golf. While strolling the aisles, I ran into Owen Croftoon, a guy I knew casually. We weren't close, but we'd shared some small talk over coffee in the past. As it happened, Owen's wife, Ella, and my wife, Angela, were leaving the next morning for a week-long Caribbean cruise. Owen couldn't take time off from his job, and Angela had insisted I stay home with the kids, saying I just feel like a third wheel and that it was cheaper for the two women to share a cabin. I wasn't happy about it, but I figured it wasn't worth a fight. "Are you going on that cruise tomorrow?" Owen asked me as we stood near the pest control section. "Not me," I said. "Angela told me you couldn't get time off, so I'm staying home with the kids." Owen frowned, confused. "I work for my uncle, hell. I can take time off whenever I want." I was ready to go, but Ella told me you couldn't make it. An awkward silence hung between us until an older man in a motorized cart grumbled at us to clear the aisle. I glanced at Owen, and a heavy feeling started to build in my gut. "Feel like grabbing a coffee?" I asked. "Yeah, let's do that," he replied with a shrug. 2 hours later, we sat in a corner booth at McDonald's, sipping coffee and sharing some apple pies. It didn't take long for us to connect the dots. Our wives had planned a cruise without us, and it didn't seem like it was just for girl time. The question we didn't want to ask hung in the air until I finally spoke up. "So, Owen, do you think they're meeting guys on this cruise? Or is there already someone in the picture?" Owen rubbed his face, clearly uneasy. "Want another pie?" he asked, stalling. But after a moment, he added, "I don't think Ella's out there looking for random guys. If anything, this feels planned." I nodded, my stomach sinking even more. "Yeah, that makes sense. Why go to all this trouble otherwise? If they just wanted someone random, they could find that around here." We sat quietly for a while, watching cars move through the parking lot. Finally, Owen broke the silence. "They both work at Tri-Point Casualty Insurance. It's probably someone from work." His words felt like a splash of cold water. "If they're bold enough to go on a whole cruise with them, this didn't just start last week," I said, bitterness creeping into my voice. "You think they've already crossed the line?" Owen asked quietly, staring down at the table. I didn't answer, but we both knew the truth. Owen let out a sharp breath, got up, and came back with a glass of ice water he'd bought for 30 cents. He poured it into our steaming coffee, stirring slowly. "Ella's been working late a lot recently, nights, weekends too. I didn't think much of it until now, but it's hard to ignore." "Same with Angela," I admitted, swallowing the bitter taste in my mouth. "But I'm not just going to sit here while she's out there living it up." "Agreed," Owen said firmly, a determined look on his face. We decided to meet again the next morning at the same McDonald's after the women left for the airport. Before we went our separate ways, I told Owen to keep quiet. "Don't say anything to Ella. If they know we're onto them, it's over." "Got it?" Owen said, giving me a thumbs up as I turned to head home. Back at the house, everything seemed normal. Reed, who was 7, and Jalen, who was 10, were glued to the TV. I'd spent years trying to convince them to play outside, but I'd finally given up the fight. In the kitchen, Angela was making a late lunch, moving around with her usual energy. Strangely, for someone about to leave on a week-long trip, she didn't mention the cruise, not a single word. It felt odd, suspicious even. After lunch, I took the boys outside to kick a soccer ball around while Angela focused on packing. She was completely absorbed, double-checking her bags to ensure everything was perfect for her early departure. As I played goalie for the boys, my eyes kept drifting back to the house. How had I not seen the signs earlier? How had I let myself be this blind? "Reed, Jalen," I called out. "You guys are staying with Grandma and Grandpa Farmer next week while I paint the house." They didn't argue, didn't even hesitate. In 10 minutes, they had packed their bags and were waiting by the front door. My parents' farm was a half-hour drive, and with horses to ride, it was an easy sell. Angela grumbled a little when I told her, but she didn't put up much of a fight. That night, Angela announced she was going to bed early, so she'd be well-rested for the trip. That was my opportunity. While she was in the shower, I went through her suitcase. I wasn't proud of it, but my gut told me I'd find something, and I did. Her sleepwear wasn't the usual kind you'd pack for a trip with a friend. Then, hidden in her makeup bag, I found a brand new orange bikini. But the real gut punch? At the very bottom of her suitcase was a box of 20 condoms. I stared at it for what felt like forever, my head pounding with anger and disbelief. Later, I sat in the living room, watching TV long after she'd gone to bed. Angela had international phone coverage through her job, so she'd promised to call every day. But I wasn't feeling so trusting anymore. The next morning, I dropped her off at the airport. Ella was already there, waving and smiling like everything was perfectly normal. Angela walked over and hugged her without hesitation, barely saying goodbye to me. As planned, I met Owen afterward. He was holding 2 coffees, his face grim. "Tell me you didn't find anything," he said. I shook my head. "She packed lingerie, a bikini, and condoms." Owen's jaw tightened. "Ella had 2 new dresses and yeah, same thing, condoms." "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head. If I hadn't thought to check her makeup bag, I wouldn't have found them. We sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of it all sink in. Finally, we decided it was time to act. Our first stop was Tri-Point Casualty Insurance, where Angela and Ella worked. We asked to speak with Glenn Ward, the head of HR. Glenn had been in our high school class. He wasn't exactly a friend, but he was someone we could talk to. When Glenn walked into the room and saw us, his expression immediately fell. "Shut the door," he said flatly. "Know why we're here, Glenn?" Owen asked as he sat down. "I've got a pretty good idea," Glenn muttered, staring down at his desk. "How many employees are on vacation this week?" I asked. "Is that a question or a demand?" Glenn replied, narrowing his eyes. "Both," Owen said, his voice firm. Glenn sighed, tapped at his keyboard, and said, 14 employees, including Angela and Ella. "Can you print that list for us?" Owen asked, leaning forward. With another sigh, Glenn typed a few commands. The printer whirred to life, spitting out 2 sheets of paper. He handed them to us, watching closely as we scanned the pages. As I glanced through the names, one stood out immediately, Clayton Marlowe. Then another name jumped out, Calvin Salisbury. My heart sank. I nudged Owen, who leaned in to look. "These 2 are on the same cruise as Angela and Ella," I said, folding the paper in half. "We don't need to see the rest. That's all we need to know." Owen leaned forward. "Out of curiosity, do you know the room pairings?" Without saying a word, Glenn opened a drawer, pulled out 2 photos, and placed one in front of each of us. They showed Calvin and Clayton, smiling in company polos at some team-building event. "Does anyone else know about this?" I asked, narrowing my eyes at Glenn. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair before finally admitting, "Everyone knows." Owen leaned forward, his tone sharp. "I thought the company had a policy against this kind of thing. It's only an issue if someone files a formal complaint," Glenn explained, glancing at the door. "And even then, it usually just results in a warning unless things escalate." "And what if we push for more?" Owen asked, staring him down. Glenn straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening. "You 2 aren't thinking of causing me any trouble, are you?" Owen and I exchanged a quick look. No words were needed, we were on the same page. "Glenn," I said firmly, keeping my voice even. If those 4 are still employed here next week, we're filing a lawsuit. You can take your pick, deal with our attorney or your legal department. Glenn ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting between us. Look, I'm sorry about all of this, he said, trying to sound sincere. Nobody reported anything, and since everything seemed consensual, we didn't intervene. We knew something was going on, but without a formal complaint, there wasn't much we could do. Well, now you've got one, I said, standing up. Fire all 4 of them, and this ends quietly. If not, we'll see you in court, and it's going to get very public. Owen and I shook his hand before leaving. He tried to smile, but it didn't stick. In the parking lot, Owen turned to me. So, what's the next move? First, we talk to a lawyer, I said. Then we grab some lunch. After that, we visit the travel agency. We pulled into the parking lot of the law office, but as we prepared to head inside, Owen hesitated. His face was tight with concern. What's wrong? I asked, studying him. Arthur, what exactly are we asking this lawyer to do? He asked, his voice uneasy. I tilted my head. What do you mean? Owen glanced toward the office door, frowning. Look, once we walk in there, this is going to cost us. And for what? A divorce? Great. We'll be free from them, but think about it. We'll still be stuck paying alimony, child support, the mortgage, their bills, everything. Courts don't care who cheated. We'll be footing the bill for credit cards, cell phones, and probably college, too. And then what? We're broke and alone. I leaned against the car, rubbing the back of my neck. The only reason I'd even think about it is for the kids, I muttered. I can't lose them, Owen. I just can't. I get it, man, Owen said quietly. If I couldn't see my girls, it'd kill me. But it's like the system is set up to punish us no matter what. Ella cheats, and I'm still the one paying for it. It's a trap, I said, shaking my head in frustration. Stay and you deal with the mess. Leave and you lose everything. Who came up with these rules? Owen sighed, kicking at the gravel. Fair? None of this is fair, Arthur. Not a damn thing. We stood there in silence, both feeling the weight of it all. Finally, I spoke up. Angela's a great mom. I won't deny that. If I had to do it on my own, I couldn't do half of what she does. Owen nodded. Same with Ella. As much as it stings, she's a better parent than me. My girls adore her. And here I am, looking like the bad guy. We didn't say much after that. Just stood there, watching the world move on around us. You want to grab some ribs? Owen finally asked. Yeah, I said with a sigh. I could use that. We shared a full rack, downed 3 beers each, and drowned our frustrations in banana pudding and strong coffee. By the time we sobered up, it was time for our next stop, Bright Horizons Travel Agency. The place was run by Nancy Raburn, an old family friend turned ex-friend. She booked trips for nearly everyone in our circle. If not for loyalty, her business wouldn't have survived in the age of online booking. When we walked in, Nancy's face immediately tensed up like she already knew what we were there for. Her junior agents exchanged nervous glances before hastily heading out for lunch, leaving a half-eaten brown bag on one of the desks. Everyone knew. Owen and I sat down across from Nancy, who fidgeted nervously. Her fake smile didn't last long. Tapping her fingers on the desk, she finally broke the silence. How can I help you two today? She asked, her voice tight. Owen and I exchanged a glance before bursting into laughter, loud enough to echo through the small office. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low but firm. You've got 5 minutes to spill everything you know, or we'll cause such a scene that this place will look like a crime scene by the time the cops show up. Nancy's eyes darted around the room. Come on, guys, she pleaded. Cut me some slack. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. You sure about that? Owen said, standing up and turning toward the entrance. The couple browsing brochures by the rack froze as Owen called out, Hey, folks, you might want to step outside for a bit. Things are about to get interesting in here. All right, Nancy hissed, waving her hands frantically. Sit down, both of you. Just don't drag me or my business into trouble. I don't need more problems. Then answer the question, I said. Who else is with Angela and Ella? Nancy sighed, trying to act clueless. Arthur. There are over 1,000 people on that ship. You know exactly what I'm asking, I said sharply. Which of their Tri-Point casualty co-workers are on that ship? Nancy pressed her lips together, her expression defiant. I can't tell you that, she said firmly. Okay, Owen said, his voice calm but full of tension. Then just tell us this. What room are Angela and Ella staying in? Nancy fidgeted in her seat. They're in room 117 on the sunset deck, she said, her voice shaky. That's not what I asked, I said, leaning forward and tapping the desk hard enough to make her pen wobble. You know exactly what I mean, Nancy. Her face twisted with frustration. What are you trying to prove, Arthur? What do you want from me? I want to know where Clayton Marlowe and Calvin Salisbury are staying, I said, staring directly into her eyes. Tell me their room numbers. Her eyes flicked toward the door, but it was too late to make an escape. They're in room 119, she muttered. Owen leaned in, his voice as cold as ice. Calvin Salisbury is sharing a room with my wife, Ella? Nancy's hands trembled as she tried to push her chair back. No, she stammered. Ella and Calvin are in room 117. Angela and Clayton are in 119. She hesitated, then blurted. But I didn't arrange it. Someone else did. I just followed orders. Realizing she'd said too much, her eyes widened, and she clamped her mouth shut. Reluctantly, she handed over the reservation documents we'd requested. It was hard to tell if she was about to cry or just panicking, but she kept her gaze fixed on her desk. As Owen and I prepared to leave, I leaned in close. Don't call anyone. Not on the ship, not in town. If we hear even a whisper that you tipped them off, you'll have much bigger problems than us showing up here again. My voice was cold, and she knew I meant every word. Owen shook his head. So what now? I'm not sure yet, I admitted, but this felt like something we had to do. Owen decided to drop his 2 daughters, Melanie and Miriam, off with his sister Beth. She already had 2 teenage girls, so taking care of his daughters for a few days wouldn't be much of a stretch. Once everything was settled on his end, Owen met me back at my house. That night, we sat at my kitchen table, poring over brochures, cruise schedules, and booking websites as we pieced together a plan. By then, there was no denying it. Our marriages were over. There was no way to come back from this. Our focus shifted to the kids. We needed to figure out what life would look like for them. Owen and I agreed that a messy divorce would only hurt the kids, so we decided to take a different approach. Instead of rushing into legal battles, we'd each find a way to protect our children's well-being as best as we could. I had an idea forming in the back of my mind. If I handled it carefully, I could stay in the house with Angela, not as her husband, but as someone co-parenting for the sake of our boys. This way, I wouldn't be stuck paying for 2 households, and I'd still have control over the finances. It would also help me save for the boys' college when the time came. That was the long-term plan, though. For now, we had more immediate problems to deal with. The cruise ship offered free Wi-Fi, so Owen planned to bring his laptop to download as much information as possible. Contacts, family, friends, coworkers, phone numbers, emails, addresses, everything. Handling cell phones would be a bigger challenge, but we'd deal with that later. According to the ship's schedule, it would dock in Montego Bay on Wednesday morning. We found a sightseeing flight that would get us there by 7 a.m. It was cheap, and booking it took less than an hour. We also reserved a cabin on the ship for the remainder of the cruise under aliases. Later that evening, Angela left me a message saying they'd settled into their cabin and were already at sea. She even asked me to let Owen know that Ella was on board. Her casual tone made my blood boil. She sounded so carefree, as if nothing was wrong. The next day, Owen and I spent the morning sorting out our finances. I moved my bank accounts, adjusted bills, and locked down my credit cards to make sure nothing could blindside me later. I also packed up my personal belongings and dropped them off at my parents' house for safekeeping. Owen did the same, leaving his belongings with his brother for safekeeping. A coworker of mine agreed to let us park our cars at his house, and he even gave us a ride to the airport. We left just after midnight. The flight was uneventful, and by sunrise, we'd landed in Jamaica. The airport was only a short taxi ride from the cruise ship's port. We traveled light, just 2 carry-on bags and Owen's laptop. No need to dress up, so we packed only the essentials. As the sun rose, its light spilling over the market stalls, we watched passengers disembark from the ship. Some headed into town, while most boarded the neatly lined-up tour buses. Everything ran like clockwork, as if it had been rehearsed countless times. And then there they were. Angela and Ella walked off the ship, wide smiles lighting up their faces. Behind them, holding their hands, were Clayton Marlowe and Calvin Salisbury. I didn't need a second glance to confirm it. Those 2 men were younger than us, but they didn't have the toughness that comes from real, hard work. Watching them together with our wives left me feeling hollow inside. Owen and I sat on small stools, sipping cold sodas, blending in with the other tourists. We watched silently as the 4 of them boarded a bus bound for Dunn's River Falls. "Time to move," Owen muttered. He approached the ticket collector with a friendly smile, slipped the bus driver some cash, and explained what we needed. Jamaicans are known for their sharp negotiating skills, so it took 5 minutes and $200 before the driver agreed to our plan. Our instructions were simple. Take as many pictures as possible of the 2 couples at the falls. If he captured anything more intimate, he'd get a bonus. The driver grinned, gave us a thumbs up, and boasted about his camera skills. He even hinted he'd need another $200 for special photos. I didn't hesitate. I handed over the cash. Once the bus was gone, we turned our attention to the ship. At the check-in desk, another $100 secured us spots on board under the names Bob Jones and James Moore. Officially, we were now passengers. We skipped settling into our cabin and grabbed sandwiches instead. For the next 2 hours, we explored the ship, mapping out every stairwell, elevator, and passageway. We avoided the dining room and showroom, knowing those were places Angela and Ella were likely to frequent. Back in our cabin, Owen set up his laptop and confirmed the Wi-Fi was stable. For a moment, we considered breaking into Angela's and Ella's rooms, but we decided against it. Patience would serve us better. That afternoon, we waited near the port entrance for the buses to return. Sitting with glasses of Red Label in hand, we passed the time until 3 o'clock sharp, when the bus from Dunn's River Falls pulled up. Angela, Ella, Clayton, and Calvin stepped off, looking like they just walked out of a vacation advertisement. Their cheeks were sunburned, their smiles loose and carefree, and they carried the glow of people who'd had an adventurous day. Angela looked so happy it made me feel sick. The ticket collector approached us, grinning like he'd hit the jackpot. "You're gonna love these," he said, flipping through the photos on his phone. Owen handed him a cold beer before he could start bragging. We scanned the pictures, and with each swipe, our jaws tightened. There was more hand-holding, cuddling, and kissing than we'd expected. Some shots were so bold, I couldn't believe they'd let themselves be seen in public like that. I handed the collector another $200, plus $100 more for the driver. "Worth every penny," I muttered under my breath. We waited until Angela, Ella, and their companions were gone before heading back to our cabin. There was still plenty to do. On the balcony, we had a clear view of the entrance to the main dining hall. Couples started lining up for dinner, dressed to the nines. "Bet they show up early so they can hit the dance floor later," Owen said, taking a sip from his glass. Sure enough, there they were. Clayton and Calvin strolled into the dining hall like seasoned couples, their hands intertwined with Angela's and Ella's. They weren't just walking side by side. They looked like they belonged together. Owen raised an eyebrow at me, clearly thinking the same thing. I didn't say a word. Instead, I got up, walked to the service phone in our cabin, and made a quick call. When I returned to my chair, I was grinning. "Wait for it," I said, keeping my eyes on the dining hall. Just as they reached the front of the line, the ship's intercom buzzed to life with a crisp announcement. "Attention, Owen Croftoon. Please join your party on the Leo deck. Owen Croftoon. Please join your party on the Leo deck. Owen Croftoon. Please join your party on the Leo deck." For a moment, the dining hall froze. Then, like a reflex, Ella's head snapped around as though someone had yanked her by a string. She nudged Angela, and they exchanged frantic glances. Behind them, Clayton and Calvin stood still, looking clueless but patient. "Look at them," Owen said, leaning forward with a smirk. "They're trying so hard to act normal." Ella pulled Angela aside, whispering urgently. The two women scanned the room, their movements sharp and panicked. "Welcome to the show, ladies," I muttered, raising my glass toward them. "Welcome to the show." Nancy's warning about who arranged their rooms echoed in my mind as I watched Ella pull out her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen, dialing one of her speed dials. After about 30 seconds, she shook her head at Angela, clearly frustrated. Angela then pulled out her own phone, made a call, and had the same result. They exchanged worried glances but eventually headed into the dining hall. "That was brilliant," Owen said with a chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "I'd pay good money to hear the conversation they're having right now. Bet it's priceless." I grinned, and we both let out quiet laughs before heading to the sunset deck for tacos and margaritas. We kept the mood light for about an hour, but there was still work to do. Back in our cabin, we got serious. The ship was docking in Cancun the next day, and we needed to be ready. No one back home knew where we were. Not our parents, not our friends, and definitely not our wives. If anyone tried calling, they'd hit dead ends. First, we transferred all the photos from Dunn's River Falls to Owen's laptop. The pictures told the story plainly. Angela and Ella with Clayton and Calvin, sharing smiles and laughter. Some shots were innocent enough, but others showed more intimate moments. Hand-holding, cuddling, even kissing. Angela's new orange bikini, the one I'd found in her makeup bag, made an appearance in several pictures. At one point, a wardrobe mishap left her giggling as she tried to adjust it. A video would have been even better, but we had enough. Owen worked on creating a collage, selecting a dozen of the clearest, most incriminating shots. The final page featured each of the four of them, caught in various affectionate poses. We each picked a favorite, and Owen made sure those were front and center. Then we got creative. By 9 o'clock, we'd sent out over 200 emails. The message was simple. A cheerful e-card with the caption, "Having a great time. Wish you were here." Attached were the collage and photos of the happy couples. Everyone at Tri-Point Casualty got a copy, as did family, friends, and just about anyone else we could think of. After the work was done, we headed up to the sky deck. It was quiet, with only the wind for company. We found a secluded spot, cracked open 3 beers each, and toasted to a successful day. We didn't know what the next step would be, but after the e-card stunt, we figured we'd repeat it the next day. The following morning, we woke up early, grabbed breakfast, fruit, danishes, and coffee, and avoided the main dining room. Instead, we stuck to quieter spots and took only stairwells, steering clear of the elevators. We weren't taking any chances. By mid-morning, we were on the sun deck, lounging with rum drinks in hand. From our spot, we had a clear view of the pool as it filled with passengers laying out towels and splashing in the water. Angela and Ella arrived soon after, settling into 2 poolside chairs. Oddly enough, there was no sign of Clayton or Calvin. "Where do you think they went?" Owen muttered, scanning the deck. "Don't know, don't care," I replied, sipping my drink. "But let's have some fun." At the far end of the deck, a teenage boy sat glued to his phone, texting furiously. I nudged Owen and we made our way over. Approaching a teenager without raising suspicion isn't easy, but we managed. For $20, the kid let us borrow his phone. I punched in Angela's number. "Hello?" she answered, her voice casual but curious. "Hey, Angela. It's Arthur," I said, letting a note of surprise creep into my tone. "Sorry I missed your call last night. I tried calling home 3 times, but nobody picked up." There was a brief pause. "Arthur, this call is showing as coming from Baltimore," she said, her voice sharp with confusion. "Yeah, had to borrow this phone," I replied smoothly. "You know I can't call from mine. Everything okay? Your parents didn't seem to know where you were." Angela's tone shifted immediately. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just busy," she answered quickly. "We're having a great time. Too bad you couldn't join us." Her voice sounded lighter, almost too casual. "Yeah, I bet," I replied with a short laugh. "By the way, that orange bikini? Looks great on you. Never seen it before." Silence. "What?" Angela blurted, her voice sharp and panicked. I grinned wide as I ended the call, handing the phone back to the teen. Owen and I burst out laughing, wiping tears from our eyes. I handed the kid another $20 and said, "Don't say a word about this to anyone." The boy nodded eagerly, his eyes wide. "This is awesome," he said, slipping the cash into his pocket. We watched from a distance as Angela and Ella grew visibly agitated. Angela pulled her towel over her head, clearly trying to stay unnoticed. The two of them scanned the deck, their eyes darting around like prey sensing danger. Angela called the number we'd used twice but got no answer. About 15 minutes later, Clayton and Calvin returned. Owen got up, made his way to the service phone, and came back grinning. Moments later, the intercom buzzed again. "Attention, Owen Croftoon. Please join your group at the shuffleboard court." "Owen Croftoon. Please join your group at the shuffleboard court." Angela and Ella jumped up, scrambling to grab their bags. They hurried toward the shuffleboard court, glancing around nervously like spies on the run. Meanwhile, Clayton and Calvin stood there, visibly annoyed but clueless. "They'll wait there for half an hour. Bet on it," Owen said, leaning against the railing. And that's exactly what happened. Angela and Ella hung around the shuffleboard court, pacing like lost tourists. After 30 minutes, they gave up and headed back toward the cabin deck. Angela pulled out her phone, her expression darkening as she scrolled through it. "She's seen the e-cards," I said, watching her. "She's probably calling her mom or one of her sisters." "No point," Owen replied, shaking his head. "Everyone she calls has already seen it." We spent the afternoon relaxing and watching the day unfold. When dinner rolled around, Clayton and Calvin showed up at the dining room, but Angela and Ella didn't. The two men spent the evening drinking at the cabaret bar on the lagoon deck. We followed them from a distance, grabbing beer and pizza from a quiet corner. "Think they'll talk about it?" Owen asked, nodding toward the two men. "Maybe," I replied, taking a sip, "but I doubt they'll say anything useful." The night ended with Calvin and Clayton so drunk they needed crew members to escort them back to their cabins. We watched from the shadows as the scene played out. The next morning, we were on the sun deck, eating fruit and drinking coffee as the ship pulled into Cancun. Crowds gathered on the promenade deck, waiting to disembark. Angela and Ella were among the first to leave, luggage in hand. "That's not a day trip," Owen muttered, watching them. "Nope," I agreed. "They're gone." While other tourists lined up for buses, Angela and Ella hailed a cab and disappeared without looking back. Clayton and Calvin also left, boarding a bus headed to a nearby resort. "Well, that changes things," Owen said, tapping the table. With most of the passengers ashore, the ship felt calmer. We enjoyed a long lunch in the dining room, strategizing for the days ahead. The cruise had one more stop before heading back to Grand Cayman. We weren't done yet. That evening, we spotted Clayton and Calvin in the dining room, sitting at a table for four with two empty seats. Owen and I exchanged glances and silently agreed on our next move. Without hesitation, we walked in, took the empty seats, and leaned back as if we'd been invited. Calvin glanced up and nodded slowly, while Clayton's face tightened with irritation. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said with a smile. "I assume you know who we are." Calvin nodded again, his movements deliberate. Clayton didn't say a word, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched on the table. "Gentlemen," I said, leaning back casually, "Mr. Croftoon and I won't be joining you for dinner. But with only 3 days left on this cruise, we thought it would be wise to share a little friendly advice." From the corner of my eye, I saw Owen suppressing a grin as I kept my focus on Calvin and Clayton. "Did you know," I continued, "that an average of 222 people go overboard on cruises every year? And they're never found." The table went silent. I let the words linger, watching as they sank in. Then Owen and I stood, calmly pushing in our chairs. Stay safe, fellas, I added, nodding at them before walking away. We didn't look back, but I heard Calvin muttering in a frantic tone as we left the dining room. His words were too quiet to catch, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. That night, we opted for tacos and beer. The wind outside was too strong for the deck, so we stayed indoors, eating by a window with a view of the sunset. The amber glow lit up the ocean, streaking it with gold and orange. That was a bold move back there, Arthur, Owen said, still smirking. Not sure what your goal was, but you definitely got their attention. Honestly, I'm not sure either, I admitted, taking a sip of beer. Let's regroup tomorrow and figure out our next move. But tomorrow came sooner than expected. Gentlemen, I'm Mr. Sorensen. May I have a moment of your time? The voice was deep and steady. When we turned, we saw an imposing crewman flanked by two silent attendants. He was Nordic-looking, tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of absolute authority. Owen and I exchanged a glance, already grinning. We nodded together. Am I speaking to Mr. Jones and Mr. Moore? Sorensen asked, his sharp eyes scanning us. Or to Mr. Croftoon and Mr. Farmer? I sighed and waved off the game. Croftoon and Farmer, I admitted. There was no point in pretending anymore. Some passengers reported that you threatened to throw them overboard, Sorensen said bluntly. Care to explain that accusation? We didn't threaten them, I replied calmly. We just shared a maritime statistic. Did you know that 222 people go overboard every year? We thought it was good advice for them to be careful. Don't play games with me, Sorensen snapped, his eyes narrowing. You know exactly what you're doing. Why would we do something like that? Owen asked, feigning shock, his voice dripping with innocence. Sorensen wasn't buying it. He gestured toward a quieter section of the lounge, and we followed. His attendants stayed behind, arms folded like statues. Gentlemen, Sorensen began, his voice low but firm. Did you threaten Mr. Salisbury and Mr. Marlowe? Owen and I exchanged a glance and silently agreed on our next move. Yes, I admitted. We did. Sorensen raised an eyebrow. Care to explain why? I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. I think you already know. In fact, you played a part in it. He tilted his head slightly, studying me. Go on. Nordic Cruise Lines arranged for Mr. Salisbury and Mr. Marlowe to share staterooms with our wives, I said slowly, watching his reaction. Calvin Salisbury with Ella Croftoon and Clayton Marlowe with Angela Farmer. To us, it looks like Nordic Cruise Lines is running a cruise for housewives seeking boyfriends. And while I'm sure your legal fine print protects you, it doesn't make it any less disgusting. Sorensen's face shifted slightly, showing more irritation than surprise. Mr. Farmer, he said with forced patience, I understand your frustration with your wife's choices, but surely you don't believe the cruise line encourages infidelity. We're a family-oriented company, and we take that reputation very seriously. Is that so? I replied, leaning back with a smirk. Then you'll have no problem defending that claim in front of TV cameras. Sorensen's jaw tightened, but he didn't lose his composure. Regrettably, we'll need to document this for the proper authorities. They may have questions for you. Which authorities? Owen asked, his grin widening. Aren't you the authority on this ship? Mr. Farmer, Mr. Croftoon, Sorensen said, his tone now firm. I need your word that you'll avoid any further interaction with Mr. Salisbury and Mr. Marlowe for the remainder of the cruise. Can you promise that? Absolutely, I said with a broad smile. You have our word. He didn't look convinced, but he signaled for his attendants, and the three of them walked away. Owen and I sat in silence for a moment, savoring the small victory. Let's send a few more emails, Owen said, grinning. That night, we got to work. We drafted press releases and emails to every media outlet we could think of. We didn't hold back, even suggesting that Nancy Roger at Bright Horizons Travel was arranging cruises for married women seeking affairs. Felt justified at the time. Among the 32 press releases, we sent 2 directly to Piccolo World Tours, the parent company of Nancy's agency. We knew tabloids wouldn't print everything, but some of it would make the headlines. The next morning, Owen and I had breakfast on the Leo deck. As we sipped our coffee, Owen checked his phone. "One missed call," he said, narrowing his eyes as he scrolled. "It's from my dad." I checked mine as well. "One missed call from my father." I stepped aside and called back. "Dad? It's Arthur. I saw you called. What's going on?" His heavy sigh came through the line. "Son, I assume you know more about this than I do. All I know is that Angela showed up on Wednesday and took the boys with her." I froze. "She what?" "You asked me not to let her take them," he said, his voice tinged with disappointment. "But, son, I'm not going to wrestle your wife in front of the boys. She packed them up and left in a hurry." I leaned against the railing, my chest tightening as his words sank in. "Did she say where she was going?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Not exactly," my dad replied, his voice steady but concerned. "But I heard her say something to Jalen about Noble's Grove, and it seemed to cheer him up. You know how much he loves that place." Noble's Grove. Of course. It was a lakeside cabin community where Angela's sister owned a timeshare. She'd taken the boys there a couple of times during spring break. It made sense, she was likely hiding out there. I ended the call and called Owen over. "They took the kids," I said, my voice low but tight. "She's holed up at Noble's Grove." Owen cursed under his breath, gripping the back of a chair. "So what now?" "We're going home," I replied, my mind already racing ahead. "We go home, and we end this." Later that morning, the ship docked at Grand Cayman. Passengers gathered to disembark, and I noticed breakfast trays stacked outside Calvin and Clayton's cabins. Neither of them had been out. Eventually, we saw Calvin rolling his luggage toward the ramp. He wasn't just stepping off for a tour, he was leaving for good. No sign of Clayton. Owen had been busy checking his email. "We've got over 30 responses to the e-cards," he said, scrolling through his inbox. "Most people think it's hilarious. But," he glanced up with a wry smile, "not everyone's laughing." "Let me guess, family?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Yup. Siblings, cousins, a few aunts. They think we're despicable and petty," Owen said with a snort. "But you know what? I don't care. We didn't send it for them." He was right. We didn't. The people we did send it for had definitely gotten the message. Some of the replies were pure gold: friends, old college buddies, and even a few coworkers replied with gifs, memes, and laughing emojis. It felt good to know the right people had seen it. Angela and Ella? Not a single message. Not a word. That night, we made sure to fully charge our phones before bed. There would be no missed call or "I didn't see it" excuses when we got back home. Before calling it a night, we sent out 32 more press releases. We didn't care about formatting or targeting the right recipients. 2 of them went straight to Piccolo World Tours, the parent company of Bright Horizons travel agency. We made sure Nancy Roger felt the heat, accusing her agency of organizing escapade cruises for married housewives and their boyfriends. We might have gone too far, but at that point we didn't care. She played her part, and now she'd face the consequences. By the time our heads hit the pillows, the wheels were already in motion. The next morning, news began to trickle in. Our story had hit newspapers, gossip blogs, and even a few TV exposé shows. Our inboxes blew up with messages. People were talking, and it felt like a win. Owen and I had breakfast on the Leo deck, the sun warm and bright over the water. It was quiet and peaceful, the kind of peace you get after dropping a grenade and walking away from the explosion. We ate slowly, savoring one last moment of calm before reality set in. When we finished, Owen turned on his phone. It buzzed immediately with missed notifications. "Missed call from my brother," Owen said, frowning. "Yours ringing yet?" When they were leaving, I heard her mention Noble's Grove. Owen and I sat in the dimly lit Leo lounge, nursing our 3rd beers of the night. The ship swayed gently, and we watched tired passengers shuffle back and forth, eager to disembark. Somewhere in that crowd, Clayton might have been among them, but we didn't spot him. The bartender, always friendly, wiped down the counter and gave us a nod. "Lounge is closing soon, gentlemen." We nodded, drained the last of our beers, and headed back to the stateroom. But as soon as we arrived, something felt off. Our luggage was already packed and sitting in the aisle outside the door. Owen and I exchanged a look just as a crew member approached. "The authorities will be meeting you regarding your behavior during the cruise," he said in an official tone, though not hostile. "What authorities?" I asked, confused, but he didn't elaborate. The next morning, we disembarked without incident. No authorities, no reporters, no big scene, nothing. It was anticlimactic, to say the least. We managed to grab the last 2 seats in the airport limo van. The ride was silent, each of us lost in thought. Booking a one-way, last-minute flight home had drained what was left of our wallets. But we had no choice. Owen stared out the window during the flight, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. We had started this whole thing with bold plans, convinced we could control the outcome. Now, as we sat on that plane, it was clear how little control we actually had. Owen still had his daughters, even if Ella was gone. Me? I had no wife, no kids, nothing waiting for me at home. When I walked into the house, the silence hit me like a punch to the gut. No boys arguing over video games, no Angela humming while folding laundry, just emptiness. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I called Angela's workplace, but the receptionist informed me she no longer worked at Tri-Point Casualty. My guess? Calvin, Clayton, Angela, and Ella had all been fired. The next morning, I threw myself into cleaning the house. I boxed up Angela's leftover belongings, tossing anything that didn't belong. Later, Owen called to tell me Ella had pulled a disappearing act, too. "She stopped by Beth's house to thank her for watching the girls," Owen said, his voice weary. "Then she packed her car and disappeared. Didn't even take the kids with her. She just left." I asked, shaking my head. "Yeah," Owen muttered. "Didn't say where she was going. Beth says the girls are fine, though." "Sounds like we're living the same story," I said. "Angela cleaned out her closet and took the boys' clothes with her. My guess is she went to her sister's place in Mount Carmel." 2 weeks later, I called Angela's sister, Samantha. "She stayed here for one night," Samantha said stiffly. "Then she left. Didn't say where she was going." "You sure about that?" I pressed, though I could tell she was holding something back. "I'm sure, Arthur," she said firmly. "I'd tell you if I knew more." I didn't push further. It wouldn't have helped. 6 weeks later, I stopped by the boys' old school to check on their records. The woman at the front desk smiled brightly. "Oh, yes," she said, typing away on her keyboard. Their records were transferred 2 weeks ago to North Shock Hill Elementary in Frackville. "Everything's set." Frackville, I repeated, my stomach sinking. She'd moved them out of town. She beamed, proud of her efficiency. "Yup, everything's in order." That's when I knew I had to call Angela. I found her new cell number and dialed 3 times before she finally picked up. "Hello?" she answered, her tone defensive. "It's Arthur," I said bluntly. "We need to talk." Silence. "Fine," she muttered. "Where?" "The food court at Frackville Mall," I replied. 30 minutes. She showed up 40 minutes later. By the time she sat down, my coffee was cold. She didn't get anything to drink, just sat across from me with her hands resting on the table. No greetings, no pleasantries. "I want you and the boys to move back into the house," I said, breaking the silence. Her eyes narrowed. "All of us together?" "No," I replied flatly. "Just you and the boys. I'll move into a small apartment nearby. The boys can go back to their old school, and I'll be close enough to see them regularly." Her brow furrowed. "I can't afford that. I don't make enough for rent, utilities, food." "I'll pay for it," I interrupted. "I'll cover rent, utilities, groceries, school costs, and clothing for the boys. But you, Angela, are a grown woman. I'm done carrying you. Get a job that fits their school schedule or work evenings. You'll figure it out." She scanned my face, searching for a way to argue, but I didn't budge. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "For the boys." I stood, placing my empty cup on the table. "I'll move out in a few days. You can move in whenever you're ready." "Anything else you want to say?" she asked as I turned to leave. I glanced back. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but I didn't say a word. 6 months later, I had the boys every weekend. Angela found a job with flexible hours, and it seemed to be working. Owen and I drifted apart. He still had his daughters, but I had nothing but an apartment and quiet nights with microwave dinners. Then came the day everything unraveled. I walked into my office after lunch and froze. Reed and Jalen were sitting in the waiting area, their backpacks at their feet. "What are you doing here?" I asked, stunned. "Why aren't you in school?" "The furnace broke," Jalen muttered, staring at his shoes. "They sent everyone home." "Okay," I said, taking a breath. "When did you get here?" "We went home first," Reed replied. "Then we came here." The key was under the mat. Something wasn't right. They avoided my eyes, staring at the floor. "What's wrong?" I pressed. "Tell me." Jalen hesitated, his face pale. "When we got home, Mom's bedroom door was open." I stilled, waiting. "She was in there with a man," Jalen added, his voice shaking. My stomach dropped. "Who?" "Clayton," Jalen whispered. "They didn't have clothes on." I didn't need to ask for more. Jalen pulled out his phone and handed it to me. "Photos." It only took one glance to confirm it. "Mom said if we told you, we'd have to move back to Frackville," Reed said quietly. "Not happening," I muttered, already planning my next move. I packed the boys' clothes, loading the last bag as Angela walked in. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded, her hands on her hips. "The boys are leaving with me," I replied calmly. "If you want them back, take me to court." Her face twisted in rage, but I stayed firm. I leaned in. "Oh, and Angela? The furnace broke at school today. That's how the boys got home early." Her face went pale. I picked up the last bag. "Jalen took pictures," I said evenly. "Clayton's gonna need health insurance." Her eyes were hollow as I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. We bought a small trailer and never looked back.